Alrighty, so not sure where to start tonight. I sort of just kind of been bouncing off some of ideas today. I find my focus keeps wandering. But I do have some thoughts, and I've enjoyed playing around with ideas along. I was actually doing some rewrites of a bunch of superheroes earlier in the day, just figuring out, like, all right, if you take, it's not like full rewrites. It's if you were to take certain interesting. So I wasted a lot of the day doing that, but I had some fun doing it. But what we're working on right now, or what we're supposed to work on today, was one of two things: doing a reimagining or making a new story inspired by one of those other settings. And I feel like the first one we did last time was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and honestly, it's also one of the first ones that really had, gave me an idea for a foothold to enter into, which was the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. The other thing I was supposed to work on today was going to be trying to figure out that last bit of the First Mothers, trying to figure out what is the fourth world that I need to start building out. So I think potentially I'm going to start with a little bit on that. I don't have as far as I want to get with that yet. So the thing to keep in mind for a lot of this was I want the four mothers to be individual worlds. Maybe not maybe a world isn't the right word. Universes. Because they could be multiple planets, I guess. But the idea was Sentinels was a superhero. And my brain has been playing around that one since I sort of landed last night at one point, that there's a little thing we haven't quite resolved about the Sentinel setting. And that was, if we're going to have a character in that setting that's a Superman equivalent, but is instead something like an elf, and trying to blend in and live among humans, the idea of having an elf from another world, say the Fey realm, that's left as a changeling and raised among humans, and their unusual abilities make them the Superman of the setting, that implies another world. And so this implies potentially what that fourth world should be, is another in which elves existed, but their world or their lifestyle or their lands or their kingdom or whatever was failing and collapsed and caused great suffering and death to all who were there. And that situation was what they used to attempt the Superman's character, Superman's parents tried desperately to save him from that fate. And so they saw another world. Well, if we take that same idea and say the elvish or fey creators, or the elvish or fey residents of this other world, change their child over there to the Sentinel setting to save him from the fate of whatever wiped them out. He's the last son of that world. So the Superman in this case, that setting that they come from would be Mira, the fourth world. So he would be the last son of Mira, essentially, instead of the last son of Krypton. Now, the other thing we have to keep in mind is that in the other settings that we have, in the other four worlds, we have to have the Sentinel setting Superman character brought to the world of Sentinels within a lifetime. So it would be within 100 years, roughly, of that time frame that the characters enter in. And in order to meet a fully fledged Superman character, it would have to be within a human lifetime of him being left as a changeling. On the same token, the world that we're going to build around the Merc Riders setting around is invaded by a parasite, but not. Originally, I was debating whether that was going to be a chaos spirit, because that's something we haven't delved a lot into just yet. The idea that the chaos spirit is the thing that's infecting their world has some potential. The problem I have is I kind of want the option for one of the characters, one of the players, to play one of the symbiotes infecting a human. And I want some of them to be able to partner with the symbiotes. It doesn't eliminate that possibility from them being chaos symbiotes. It just makes it more difficult, because thus far we've sort of portrayed the chaos element of the Empyrion Realm and any other realm that they go to as being an infectious evil. And if we do that, it makes it harder for that to be something that a character who's in other worlds is representative of fragments of a god. So if all the gods or the beings of the Empyrion Realm are in opposition to chaos, you cannot really easily have them show up into one of the vestiges they exist in a world where some fragment of them is chaos. I don't feel like that quite works well. So I have to reconcile that problem. In the Serpent's Children setting, the back mythology of that setting is that you had a character like Medusa who had a lover, and that lover theoretically could be one of the first mothers. I'm leaning towards potentially the fifth first mother, the one that represents the Empyrion Realm. And at some point, that Medusa character, the first Medusa, finds themselves in the very, very far distant past, finds themselves charmed and curious about a new arrival, so a humanoid of some kind. And by interbreeding with that one, they become pregnant, and the first mother lover, that's a horrible phrase, the first mother Dunia, who is the lover of Medusa, sort of like an Artemis and Nixie's sort of situation, is immensely angry and jealous, and withdraws the Medusa into the Empyrion Realm to keep her from the outsiders, and in doing so exposes the Medusa to some of the corrupting chaos within the Empyrion Realm, and as a consequence it changes her, it mutates her, and bestows upon her the Medusa's curse. And that curse is what carries her with her over into when she comes back to the Serpent's Children realm and births her children. She passes those traits on to her children. Meanwhile, some of her children again interbreed with the children of the beast men, as what I refer to them. And so you get the variant races of Medusa. So we have, in this sense, that in the Serpent's Children's realm, we have that doorway between one of the sub-realms and the Empyrion Realm. I feel like that doorway definitely has to appear in the distant past. And I don't know if that doorway is closed now. So basically what this ends up setting us up with is Serpent's Children links to Empyrion Realm. And they also have to have a doorway from which humans or a humanoid race can travel from. And I'm debating at this point in the back of my head whether they're actually human or if these are elves. Because if we're going to have elves be able to open doorways to other worlds, that would also be like they not only were able to, in the distant past, contact the Medusa's realm and charm her and find a mate for her at that point. If you have Serpent's Realm has doorway to the Empyrion Realm and to the Elven Realm, and the Elven Realm has a catastrophe that happens to it, and some of them open a doorway into the Sentinels realm and leave the last son of the Elven Realm to be the Superman of that universe. That leads only the question of how we connect the Merc Rider's realm to it. So Merc Riders, if the Merc Riders Merc Riders, Sentinels, and the Fourth Realm. Well, maybe I won't speak necessarily for the Fourth Realm. Sentinels and Merc Riders realms should not have accessible doorways to the Empyrion Realm. Their doors should have closed. So this is basically a campaign world, a story world, doing some world building for creating a role-playing game, writing novels, and maybe doing a video game in. maybe even doing some short animations or something like that for. And this has been before my computer crash ate all of the work I did on it. This is good. This has been a fair amount of effort put into designing this setting. The overarching setting is a world called the Empyrion Realm, and basically what you have is a continent that is like a floating island, but it's a whole continent, and it's the size, I would say, roughly of at least New Zealand. And it's a main continent orbited by smaller city-states. And on that island, on that setting, floating through the cloudy skies with nothing beneath them, are different races that sort of have a Cold War going on between them. And part of the history of this setting is that this whole realm, the Empyrion Realm, is sort of a place where beings like humans, fae, Dwergar, and gnomes, as well as other creatures, trolls, and whatnot, exist. Each one of them, I guess the best way I could think to describe it is like if you were to take your hand and put it through the surface of a bucket of water, only so far as the second knuckle on the fingers. I don't know that one. But if you take your fingers and submerge them in water, on the surface plane of that water, it looks like 5 discs, each independent of each other. And each disc represents an entity, a person. But those persons are sort of like the individual cells within each of our bodies. They could live, die, reproduce, and eat, and live a life, not ever knowing they're part of a greater whole. And so the idea of the Empyrion Realm was you have beings that technically could be perceived as gods, made up of beings in other worlds. And so I created these 4 other worlds where their components exist, unbeknownst to them, as part of a greater whole. So when you have the characters in the larger Empyrion Realm and they die or are somehow destroyed, some aspect of themselves, their spark, descends down into some of those individual discs on the surface plane of the water. And so the characters in a story or in a game would be sort of, yeah. It's basically like your heart cell doesn't know it's part of you. It's going through its life. It's working with its community of fellow cells, and it just goes about its life just not having any thoughts about whether or not you exist. But you have control by changing your thoughts and actions about your heart rate. And so you change the circumstances it lives by. And so this same concept of the individual components being affected by the choices of this God that doesn't spend any time thinking about any of its individual components. So it's just sort of like this. And I built these 4 worlds. And one of them is a fantasy superhero setting, which is basically like taking a mishmash of Marvel's New York City or Metropolis or Gotham and turning them into like Waterdeep or Eberron setting cities. Like, what is it? Sharn, I think, is Eberron for role-playing games. And so you have this city with essentially superheroes, but instead of spandex and capes, they're wearing cloaks and tabards. And so you have characters like that. And part of that setting is based on the characters emerging as superheroes within that setting, and some realization of what the nature of the monsters within that setting being kind of like the mutants from X-Men. But within that same setting, there are different types of heroes. People with special tools, like I guess like Thor's hammer would be an equivalent of a magical tool that you could have, and it would make you a hero in the setting. Or Iron Man's armor, some equivalent of that. So an enchanted armor instead of a technological armor. But you also have the option of the classic story type of Superman being the last son of Krypton, his parents being a race of Kryptonians on another world who sent their child to be saved from the destruction of their world by sending him to Earth, where he would become like a god because he has powers. So if you take that same concept and you translate it over to a fantasy setting with superheroes in it, you can take the concept from fantasy of an elf exchanging for a human child a changeling. So you have this elf being raised on Earth, or whatever realm you want to call it, as if they were a human child trying to blend in, but finding they have a famous superhero like Superman. That's sort of the Sentinel setting, which is the superhero setting. I have two other settings that I've developed as subsettings to the Empyrion Realm. One of them is called Serpent's Children, which is an entire world of Medusa-like characters. But because in mythology, Medusa is always a female and there is never really a reference made to a male Medusa, I had been writing a story years ago with a concept of an entire world with nothing but female characters who are based off of the Medusa. Now, the basic idea of the Medusas being parthenogenically reproduced, which is a term that also comes from Greek mythology, Athena Parthenos, meaning produced without mating. Basically, you have the ability of certain reptiles, which works for Medusa, the ability in the real world of certain reptiles to reproduce without mating. They lay an egg that is self-fertilized and reproduces essentially a clone of the mother. So in this setting, we have the idea of we have to establish the first occurrence of a Medusa, and then with that occurrence of Medusa, have the offspring of some kind of interaction produce all the variable. Well, there's Naga, which are a slightly different thing. That the important trick here is I want my Medusa characters to touch a little bit on, I think there's a mid to southern African tradition of fearing blacksmiths, particularly because if they can look you in the eye, if they make eye contact with you, you will be cursed to die within 3 days. There's sort of like a myth among a certain population about that. And that sort of has a similar parallel to the Medusa because of the idea of the Medusa's ability to turn you to stone with her glare. Building the setting around the idea of children of Medusa, where some of them, only a few of them, inherit that talent to turn people to stone. That was building a story around a character involved in that setting at one point, and I've sort of worked some of that over. I've worked some of that over into doing a game setting or a storytelling setting for this combined universe. And so this idea of the reptilian reproduction without mating tends to bring up the concept of if it's a clone, essentially, then you run the risk of everybody looking and seeming exactly the same. But if you have at least some point in the early phases of that where there's still sexual interbreeding, you can get variations enough to get different populations. And so at some point, there would be visitors from another realm, just like there would be elves that went to the Sentinel setting to deposit a child. In the Medusa setting, there would be ones that came and interacted with them and helped father variants on the base Medusa race. And some of them would introduce, like, the very concept for me that appealed, one of the most interesting concepts that appealed most to me about the idea of this Medusa setting that I was working on was it's the real opportunity of they don't need to breed with men, but they don't have any native men. So it would have to be an outside source, and that outside source would introduce certain mutations that would get you ones with a serpent's lower body and ones with legs. And then one of the other potential things that they could reintroduce into the population would be a mutation that causes congenital dwarfism. And the reason that one appeals to me is because you have the concept of congenital dwarfism within our human population in the real world. But once you introduce that and you have a few 6, 7, 9 members of the race with congenital dwarfism, you end up with the possibility of then having parthenogenically reproducing dwarf Medusas, so that they can actually end up becoming a whole culture and population of their own, much like the dwarves in Tolkien's mythology, where you have an entire race of dwarves. You have an entire race of dwarf Medusas, but they're created through parthenogenic reproduction of the few dwarf mutations introduced into the bloodline. So it's a complex playground that I've built for myself, and that's part of the reason why I love doing it. So the thing I have to keep in mind, though, is what I'm trying to do is I have one more setting that I've already established, which is the Merc Rider setting, but I need a fourth one to make my sequence of settings work out the way I need it for other purposes. But each of these settings so far, the Sentinels and the Serpent's Children setting, sort of require that somebody can pass from one world to another. And at this point, we're still roughly in the realm of elves, and elves at different points in history have crossed from one world to theirs. So that suggests potentially the fourth world needs to be one where elves reside at some point and build a pretty impressive empire with the ability to bridge realities. The third setting that I built is called Merc Riders. It's basically a post-apocalyptic zombie setting in which the zombies in this case are infections of basically like the Venom symbiote from Spider-Man. Basically something that gets into a wound, takes over the body, sort of like a Goa'uld from Stargate, and ends up taking over and dominating the life form that it takes over as a host. And the visual I get for this is a gradual loss of self by the person infected. And gradually you see them sort of, there's some graphic noise making of the sense of always having this thing inside you, crawling around inside you, making hacking noises, trying to get up, and just chronically feeling like you're being consumed from within, because you are, and driven slowly mad, chewing your fingertips off where the symbiote can kind of excrete itself as claws, and then tearing at your face with it and growing teeth, eyes cover on a flat surface, and you lose sight, but you can feel the sensations around you. And at some point in there, you become a rider and the thing takes over. and they're monstrous creatures. They're terrifying monsters. But they are in addition to the world. They come to the world from outside in some way. I haven't quite hashed out where that comes into play. It may be the consequence that if you start with a world of elves that build a massive empire, and they interact with the Medusas on one setting by opening a doorway, but at some point something happens that causes the impending demise of their civilization and their world, they open a doorway to the Sentinel setting and leave the last son of their realm to be Superman in that world. Is the thing that causes the end of the world the Monstrous Symbiote from Merc Riders? And is that something that happens? Do the elves come from the Merc Rider setting, or do they come from the fourth setting, and the thing that destroyed their world has leaked over into the Merc Rider setting? I haven't cracked that one yet. I'm sort of trying to work that out. It's a super elaborate mythology, and I'm interested in building basically the source book, the Bible of the setting. When you do writing shows for TV series or movies like that, they have a source Bible that they do. You usually have a pilot episode and maybe one or two other episodes, but you build a sort of Bible that tells people where the story can go from there. And that's sort of what I'm building, with the intent that I can write stories in the setting. And I can also create a tabletop role-playing game in the setting. I can make video games or short animated videos about it. Okay. Yeah, there are a couple different ways to start that kind of Merc Rider setting. And I'm trying to be careful not to lend too much from any given setting. I don't want it to be a direct follow-on from somebody else's work. That's all right. Take your time. I'll do my best to reply to each response. I like the idea of building a setting that other people can write stories in, and I can write stories in, and I can turn into a game that people can play together, or maybe even a series of choose your own adventure books, or a video game, a single player video game. These are all possibilities that work best when you build out the story and the structure around the universe that other people can then play in, be they writers or short film makers or whatever. Heck, I could probably get some of my friends I know who are into puppetry to do a series of puppetry shorts for videos. That would be weird. Yeah, and I mean, I don't find any discouragement in that at all. My tendency, and that's the other thing we talked about that I wanted to work on tonight, was I did a series of videos earlier this year, before I lost all of that data in the computer crash, of taking a look at settings, and it's something I posted somewhere on the Brass Goggles. I believe it was the writing, so literary sub forum, that I did a reimagining of League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, doing something along the lines of pulp heroes like Doc Savage and stuff like that, and bringing together a group of sort of forgotten pulp heroes. What was it? Invisible Scarlet O'Neill or something like that was one of them. and basically just sort of like saying like, okay, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen is this type of story. What if we make a similar story inspired by that using other materials and other concepts? And so I explored some of those ideas, and I built a master list. There's one of my videos that I'm going to backtrack at some point and review what I came up with. But one of those videos, I built a huge list of all these, fun genres and stories that we could start from as a base and reimagine in different ways. And one of the ones I did League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, Ghostbusters, Jurassic Park, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Stargate, Terminator, Roger Rabbit, Blade Runner. And those were all things that I took a look at. Jurassic Park was one we turned into a cyberpunk setting where somebody is using a virtual reality setting with a headset, and they're going into a park, a theme park that they can enter into that is themed on fantasy. And some of the artificial intelligence is using magic, but magic in a computer program is just specialty code that lets them manipulate the fabric of the program that they're in. Well, if you have an AI given the ability to manipulate the fabric of the reality they're in, and you enter that realm, you have the possibility of an AI trying to escape. And so I built a story around that idea of this is Jurassic Park, but instead of dinosaurs, it's wizards in a virtual reality escaping the virtual reality, and you have to survive and stop the spread of that problem. Well, and that's one of the things, like if I've done a lot of world building for the fantasy setting that I was building. And there are a couple of online fiction series that I was a fan of, and I think there was a published novel or not novel, I guess it was an anthology. Thieves' World was a fantasy anthology edited by Robert Lynn Asprin, I believe. And it was a dark, gritty fantasy setting that was composed out of short stories written by a lot of his author friends. And those stories are some of my favorites. There's also the Thieves' World, not Thieves' World, the George R.R. Martin did a Wild Cards superhero setting in a similar vein. And I'm a huge fan of that one too. And then there's an online series for LGBT people for a superhero school. And that one is one I'm a fan of too. And it's really fun to see the worlds built by people and shared, and different stories emerge in those settings. Wild Cards was one of my absolute favorites. It also made it hard for me to go back to plain comic books because it has writing kind of on par with Watchmen and something like the Kingdom Come DC stuff, and might even compare it to a certain degree with League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. It's at a level that makes going back to read like an X-Men comic book harder, because those stories are so comic booky, whereas the superheroes in Wild Cards, like, that's a real literary fictional universe. And being able to offer the option for people to write fiction in a setting that I make is half the appeal, but also being able to make a game that people can play. So like a Dungeons and Dragons, or Pathfinder is another one. I think the Cyberpunk 2020 or 2077 is the new one coming out. They're making a video game for Cyberpunk 2077, and they had a tabletop role-playing game for Cyberpunk 2020. Sort of, yeah. And being able to make the opportunity for it to be a place for people to create things and share things. And that's sort of my bread and butter, is making playgrounds that other people can play on. And that's the Empyrion Realm and the subsequent partner worlds. Those are all part of it. Half of that was stuff based off of ideas that I've had for years. But coming up with ideas like taking a look at some of the fictional settings that exist that I'm a fan of, like Highlander and stuff like that, taking a look at those things and going like, okay, so how can we reimagine those? Those are also things, but those are more like creating the idea and then seeing what different creators can make with them. Because one of the things I learned very quickly when I first started writing short stories and novels was that if you give any 5 creative people the same starting point, the same raw materials, the same building blocks, the same concepts, and you set them off to do something, when they come back in a week with the stuff they've created, you're going to get 5 different works. And they're not going to be like, there's no such thing as stealing somebody else's idea, because it's not going to be even remotely the same when they come back to the table. So like one of the things I was looking at, and you'll see in some of the previous videos, if you backtrack through my playlist of recorded videos, I have rewriting old TV series, movies, and books. And so I had, like I said, Ghostbusters, Jurassic Park, Buffy, Stargate, Terminator, Who Framed Roger Rabbit. But one of the first ones I did was, after League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, I took a look at Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And I said, all right, so what do we do with the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles to change them and make it a different and a unique setting? Instead of mutantogenic ooze, yes, very different. Everybody's got their own angle or perspective that they get to something. So you take an idea of, you have an anthropomorphic animal that becomes basically a humanoid character that's a mutant. They sort of live on the outside of society, but they have a sort of a gritty noir tone, and they're sort of heroes trying to help society from their hiding place in the sewers or whatever. And they find a human contact that they interact with. They have a master who trained them in the arts of whatever they're doing. And I said, so, okay, we take this idea and we break it down to its components, like we just did. So if we take that same concept, a human/animal mixture. So instead of turtles, let's say we do corvids of some kind, ravens or crow. And instead of male, we make them female. And starting from that branch, we take a look at the idea of doing 3 sisters, because I'm a fan of resorting to checking in with mythology every now and then. I looked at the 3 raven goddesses of Celtic mythology. The one of the terms for the 3 of them would be the Morgans. And they're basically 3 corvid themed goddesses of mythology. And if you have a humanoid corvid that resembles Kenku, or the Japanese crow demons, that sort of give them the head of a bird, the legs of a bird, but otherwise make them resemble a human. And you make 3 of them, being the result of a doctor exploring a piece of alien technology that lets them build this is very similar to the movie Fly, where they build a teleportation booth, and to test it, they used either the corvids themselves or unfertilized eggs. But in the process, it's contaminating the corvid eggs with human DNA, and they hatch into yeah, I mean, I don't think I'm familiar with Bill and Marley. Is that one about a dog? No, that's something else, isn't it? Stella's Last RP. I don't know that. Yeah, the concept I came up with for the alternative to Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Okay, so the concept I came up for the Ninja Turtles last time was the Corvid sisters detective agency, much more like a Sherlock Holmes character. So instead of ninjas, they're detectives, and instead of turtles, they're ravens. Instead of brothers, they're sisters. And the scientist who was responsible for their creation becomes sort of like a harpy, because she gets contaminated with their DNA, instead of Splinter being a rat that was trained by something or other in Ninja Turtles. So it's taking that whole idea and like breaking down to constituent parts and rebuilding into something entirely different. And I would wager you that if I created a graphic novel based off of the Raven sisters, that nobody would stop and think first off the bat, oh, this is a remake of Ninja Turtles in a whole new way. So that way of doing things, it's one of my favorite things to just do, is rehash ideas. And I kind of have a sense of what I did for a lot of these things, but I miss some of the details to some of them. And when my computer crashed, it sort of eliminated the ability to go back and check those. I can go back and watch the videos I made for each one, but I'm avoiding that right now because I think it'll be fun to do it again. Because here's the thing, like I said, if you give any 5 authors the same prompts and you set them off for a week and they come back, you're going to get 5 different stories. Well, I was author 1, and we gave me the prompt of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and League of Extraordinary Gentlemen and all those others. Those are done. They're over in my backlog of videos. But I'm going to now be author 2. Basically, I'm giving myself the exact same startup, the premise of reimagining Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but now I'm doing it from a point of like, I don't remember what I did last time specifically, so let's see what new idea I can come up with. And so the idea I started with as I started to get ready to do this video tonight was asking the question of, the idea I started off playing with tonight for remaking the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles reboot idea. It's not a reboot idea. It's inspired by, but completely different from, is in the Ninja Turtles story setting, you start them off as turtles, and they're exposed to a mutagen that turns them into turtle human hybrids, because the last thing they had contact with was a human. Now, my feeling starting from go again on this one is, let's flip that on its head. Instead, let's start these characters off as humans and then make them into mutants with other features. Now, okay, the concept that just kind of bubbles through my brain right now is, if we start them off as human and we introduce a mutation to them, in the traditional Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, they're exposed to an animal, turtles. So what if we go with plants instead, or elements? So instead of being an animal, you could do earth, air, fire, water. That becomes very much similar to the Fantastic Four, though. I think I could play with that maybe a little bit, but I'm thinking along the lines of plants. So if you mutated, we're getting very close to Swamp Thing, I think. So if you mutated humans to make them sort of human-plant hybrids, you get Poison Ivy, Swamp Thing, Groot. Is there another one like that somewhere? I mean, that's not a bad combination to start with anyway. Groot, Poison Ivy, Swamp Thing. Is there another one though? I feel like Ninja Turtles starts you with 4 turtles, and my Corvid sisters is 3 Corvids. The Raven sisters, I think is what I called them. I feel like maybe doing 5. So I got to figure out what the right combination for that would be. So if you took humans, converted them into plant-based, doing 5 of them. One's a tree, one's like a swamp mass. One of them is a sort of a toxic plant. So what are we going to stem them as? They're not going to be ninjas, because that's another key point we can deviate from. I think we'd want to be hesitant about making them specifically superheroes. Okay, so that's a transformational. So a sorcerer who assumes the form of a raven but botches it and gets stuck with the abilities of turning into a raven. So sort of like a were-raven. So a were-raven. There is a there's a were mythology. There's the traditional ones that you see in pop culture now most of the time, is somebody bitten by a werewolf or something of that ilk and turns into. But there's also something called skinwalkers. And these are shaman or other magical users who enchant the skin of a creature so that they can assume its form. And there's sort of a if you look a little bit into it, I think there's there are a couple ways you can sort of trap somebody in between their forms or in whatever form they take. Yeah, skinwalkers. And if you do something along those lines, like you could have a character who used the skins to assume a form and then took a risk and was damaged in such a way that they can't fully remove the skin. So they're partially trapped in their form. But yeah, so what I'm looking at here for my Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles reworking was, I don't know that we could do a a skinwalker for plants. But there is the equivalent of like dryads. That's not bad. That's not a bad idea. I was working a while ago on a piece of fantasy literature that was working around the idea of a dryad type hero character in which the character, in order to go on an adventure, being a creature that is bonded to a plant, you sort of have to have a sort of like you're chained to the thing that you belong to. You have a radius on which you can move, and that's about it. And the story I was working a while back was somebody. The story I was working on a while back was what is it? It was the Faytown Noir that I was working on. It was a private detective who worked, and I'm still a little angry that Carnival Row seems to have taken all of those ideas. But I mean, again, it's one of those things. It's some people have a common idea that happens to them at the same time. I'm not imagining anybody watched my video 3 years ago and came up with the concept for the Netflix TV series or Amazon Prime or whatever it was on. Carnival Row sort of took a lot of those ideas and went with it. But in my setting, you have a time period between World War I and World War II where the Fey realm comes in conjunction with Earth and they try to invade. And so you have these sort of elves and other fantasy creatures that are sort of beholden to demonic overlords that have conquered them in their own realm. And once the doorway between worlds opens, they kind of try to conquer our world. And the sort of Second World War in this case is one in which it's all of our world versus a nefarious Fey world trying to absorb ours. And in this setting, the main character is a private detective who served in that military. And in that military, he was attacked by a were creature. But in my setting, when you are hurt by a were creature, it grants you the curse of were, but it doesn't grant you the form you're going to take until a second danger to your life. So you could be attacked by a were pig, and the next creature, or a month or years from then, that nearly kills you or endangers your life is the creature you will take the form of. So being infected by a were just makes you a potential were. It's the thing that, it's sort of like if you look at the X-Men comics or some other superhero genre stuff, the idea that you're a normal human being until your mutation happens, and your mutation may take the form of something that's happening in a stressful situation. So your powers that you get may be a result of a stressful situation you're in. That same idea was what I was doing with the were creatures. Yeah, and so basically, if it's also loosely based on the idea they used to have of like why the Elephant Man was called the Elephant Man. They said his mother, while she was pregnant, was startled by an elephant, and so that's why he was deformed the way he was. That idea that when you're pregnant and most vulnerable, that you can become infected by anything that scares you, and it can cause deformities of that type. So that kind of idea was sort of where I was going with the were creatures of my Feytown Noir. And my character that I start the story with as the private detective, when he served in the military, he was injured by a were creature, and then he was injured by a dryad. And so he was scared or injured by a dryad. That was the form that he would take. So the dryad form that he ends up taking is this male detective going around a city on a regular basis, trying to help the Fey people as they try to integrate as a new population in our world. A were dryad. Essentially, on any given new moon or full moon, he turns into a dryad. And so nobody knows this. He's keeping it a big secret because it's pretty humiliating for him. But at the same time, it helps me develop the idea of a character who, as time goes by, he's having to figure out how to reconcile and deal with that situation. As a dryad, he's bonded to a tree. And my concept from that was he's bonded to a tree, but he can take cuttings from that tree and grow them into small bonsai trees. And those small bonsai trees that he tends to are extending his range of power and influence and not making it so he's so tethered to an individual tree. It also gives him a backup. If the main tree is ever damaged, he has the bonsai that he can cultivate and maintain as extensions of that tree to the point where it will not kill him in the same way if the main tree is destroyed. So back to the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle concept, if we take this idea, and basically he turns into a female dryad on a regular basis. It's super awkward for him. He had a friend he served in the military who was also turned into a were, and they're the only ones that know his alternative form. And it's a little uncomfortable between them because he doesn't know how to deal with it. But in this format for the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle version that I'm playing with right now, the idea of maybe do I want to do something magical instead of a scientific mutation of some kind? So it's potentially along the same lines that these half human, half plants are going to be a mystical creation of a dryad form. That's a very interesting potential. So instead of doing a modern take or a semi-futuristic take, we would do more of a fantasy take. And instead of turning into animals, you turn into plant hybrids. And instead of starting as animals, you start as humans. And you become dryads. Dryads are specifically oak-based, I believe. The general term and overall is tree nymphs. And what I'm looking at potentially doing here is, with the same idea as the bonsai trees from Feytown Noir, having the characters as they become tree nymphs, that they cultivate and carry around like potted plants of their particular plant species and foster them to grow into groves and stuff like that around the area. Maybe I won't do a full-blown fantasy. Maybe I will do a sort of a modern urban fantasy. Or maybe a Harry Potter-ish, where there's like the wizarding world off the side of the current world. Well, I mean, like, if you look at Harry Potter, you have everyday normal human life world, and parallel to that, if you pass through certain walls, you get secret entrances into the mysterious wizarding realm that is sort of little bubbles off the side of our reality. And there's an equivalent concept in, if you look at some of the torii gates in Japan, where when you cross over the threshold through the gates, you're entering sacred space. And so it's like there are doorways that lead to space that is not mundane space, but instead sacred space. That sort of concept of a threshold that you cross that leads to a place that is not the mundane world. You could do a world like the Harry Potter setting like that, where you have a group or unassociated human beings who have an encounter with a mystical parallel realm or a Harry Potter-like realm that is leaking or contaminating our world, our modern day. And because of that, it induces a sort of mutation, a magical transformation, forming it's sort of like that. Yeah, the Cthulhu mythology and stuff like that does sort of partake of opening passageways to other places and other realms. There's a good online series of, I'm trying to remember the name of it, The Pact. There's a guy who wrote 3 series as a serial online fiction series. Worm was a superhero one. Pact was a magic users in the modern world setting. And the third one was a sort of steampunk magical world where like Frankenstein style technology was developed. I forget what that one was called. I think that was called Twig. So if you can look up some of those, like Worm is the easiest way to get entry to that one. And it usually has a link to his other 2 universes. They're huge serial fiction. Like, I spent probably weeks binge reading Worm, and I think I'm only about a fifth of the way into the series. It's huge. But his Pact setting was a couple of kids, a kid who lives in the modern world who's estranged from his rich, powerful family in a town, and his great aunt is dying, and he goes back and he finds out that, see if I can pull up serial fiction. See if I can pull up the web address for it. Worm web series. Might be able to post the Wikipedia page for it. Okay, so copy that. See if I can post that in the chat. So, no. And here we go. Control. That's directly from the Wikipedia page. So, Worm is a self-published web serial by John C. Wildbow McCrae. And once you find that, it's a superhero series in a sort of a semi-future alternative reality. He has links from there to its sequel. I think it's Glowworm. And then there are 2 other series that he did. One was called Twig. And the other, Pact, is the one where the kid goes back to, your connection is unstable. Please wait while we try reconnecting. Yep, I've done too much and tried too much. My connection is weak. But the Pact series is about a kid who returns to a family only to find out that his great-grandmother, who is the matriarch of the family, had been a demonologist and had formed pacts with demons. And he gets embroiled in a whole world of things he didn't know existed. And in that setting, you have a modern-day world, cars, motorcycles, trains, I think even cell phones. He may have started it before cell phones were as ubiquitous as they are now. I'm trying to remember if there were any cell phone usage in that. But in that world, there are sort of senses of how that world can exist alongside our world and not be as obvious. So people don't know it's there unless they're involved in it. And some of that involves sort of pocket dimensions and sort of like the TARDIS, where you can enter a closet and there will be a whole room inside the closet that shouldn't fit there. That kind of thing. But in that setting, there is the possibility of doing that kind of world leaking into our own. That's not a bad place to start playing around with the idea of maybe doing this Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles thing as a modern day world, characters getting embroiled into the world of the mystical, otherworldly, by becoming infected with something that bonds them to a plant in a way that turns them into dryads and other nymph like characters. So that might be a way to go with that in the future here. I hadn't really thought about doing it as a modern fantasy take, but that sort of magical mutation, that sort of bonding and binding, is a very different spin on that. And so if I had a story about 5 teenagers who, through unknown means yet, get enroped into a mystical realm by becoming bonded with certain plants and thus becoming mystical equivalents of dryads. Now, I'm tempted to not make them all male or female, but a mix. It's hard to really go that way completely if I'm going to play up on some of the idea of the wood nymphs, because they're predominantly all female. I don't think I've ever heard a reference of a nymph being like there's no such thing as a male dryad. I don't know. I feel like there's a way to make that work, though. And I don't know that I want them all to be trees. I may... Yeah, it may be another case of one of those just digging through various mythologies to find out what I could make work. Because I would almost guarantee you that if you were to look at Indian, Southeast Asian, or even Middle Eastern mythologies, and possibly even like African and Egyptian mythologies, you could probably find spirits of some kind that are humanoid forms bonded to a plant, a specific plant. I'll have to do a little digging and research on that tonight as we get close to, we're almost an hour and 20 minutes into this video. I will probably come back tomorrow and explore this a little bit further. The Ifrit, those are fire-based, right? I mean, you could do elemental themes. You don't have to do plants. And that's one of the things, like, you could, I did this a few times on the last time I did these creative story bits. I did a couple times where I came up with ideas and I couldn't decide which way to go, so I made a story idea for each of them. All right, well, take care. I will talk to you in the future, either on a forum or on here, if you manage to catch it. I thank you for joining me tonight. I need to get going because I need to eat dinner before I go to bed and get ready for work tomorrow. So until then, take care and have a good night. I gotta see if I can pull up my closing statements, copy and paste. It's so much easier than try to type it out by hand with one hand in the middle of a room. Take care and have a good night. I will catch you later. Good night, everybody. Good night, Ramius. Okay, end stream and